Good morning, everybody. What's up? I hope that you had a great Thanksgiving break. I suspect that many of you didn't leave home and you might have felt cooped up, but it was nice, at least for me, to get some time away and to be able to relax and kind of kick back for a few days. So I hope that you feel refreshed and ready to get back into it. By popular demand, we're going to do a writing workshop today. So we will eventually begin talking about political participation, which is our scheduled unit for this week. But we'll begin by discussing the assignment. I'll give you an outline. I'll talk about the necessary components of the paper. And then I'll give you an example and I'll discuss how I would approach the paper. I have talked about the assignment a little bit in the last couple weeks, but we will try as hard as we can to address all the questions that come up today. So thank you very much for being here as always, and let's go ahead and get started. Before we get started though, I just want to remind you that your continued participation is really important. So we will be working together in groups today at a certain point to discuss your ideas and your approach. And I look forward to having a class discussion as well. So let's get started. Okay, so it came to my attention that the language on the syllabus was a little unclear, and I agree. I actually looked back and was a little bit aghast that I didn't actually give you more of a description of the assignment. But this is an opportunity for us to clarify the assignment and talk about how you can use the work you did on the critique to build your research paper. So as I mentioned last week, I do encourage you, and really frankly, I want you to build your research paper around your hypothesis that you developed in your critique. That's a good way for you to continue to work with the line of reasoning that you came up with through your original research for that paper. So I'll show you in detail what that means today, and we'll walk through the process step by step. So today we'll do a few things. We'll begin by describing the assignment. I've rewritten the assignment prompt, and we'll go through that in detail so that we can make sure that we're on the same page and everything is clear. We'll talk about the guidelines. I'll give you an example. And again, I'll give you an example of what I would do if I was in your shoes. If you're like me, you learn by example and you follow models that have been outlined for you, and you learn in that way. And not everyone learns that way, but examples can be really useful. So we'll use an example today. Second, we'll do some brainstorming. I'd like to get you thinking right now about this assignment. Hopefully you've already been thinking about it. The idea with building the paper around the hypothesis from your critique is to give you sort of a leg up and a head start in creating some coherence between the assignments. So theoretically, you've been sort of prepared to do this for more than a month. And so this will give us a chance to think about what you came up with and how you can connect it to this assignment and how you can build your paper around that. And then finally, we'll have a bit of a class discussion where we come back together and discuss our approach and talk about what we came up with in our small groups and where we plan to look for data and so on and so forth. And data is also an issue that we'll address today too. There have been some questions about what exactly constitutes data. That's an excellent question, and so we'll address that today too. So here is the prompt. I've rewritten this, and this gives you more detailed instructions. So let's go through this line by line and pause at the end and take any questions or comments that might come up. In a concise research paper of 3,000 words or roughly 12 double-spaced pages, develop an argument using two cases, usually countries, but not always, on a topic of your choosing. You are strongly encouraged to extend your theoretical and empirical critique paper by building your research paper around the alternative hypothesis you developed as part of your critique. You will seek out evidence from your chosen cases and use it to support your hypothesis. You will be evaluated based on the quality of the research question, comparative approach, hypothesis, and use of evidence. This is due on December 11th. So this outlines those specific components of the paper. And as I clarify in the second sentence, I really want you to extend your critique paper by building your research paper around that alternative hypothesis that you formulated through your original research. And if you didn't formulate an alternative hypothesis in that assignment, I still want you to refer back to the evidence that you collected to critique the theoretical argument from one of the readings, because that evidence can still be the basis for formulating that alternative hypothesis. So the idea here is that you've done this work already, the sort of beginning startup work, if you will. And so you're prepared then to kind of incorporate that into this paper and use that as sort of a springboard. You are expected to use basically two cases. Remember that in a comparative approach, we normally use a small number of cases. Two is often the number. In this paper, you'll use two, and those two cases will vary in the dependent variable if you choose to use the method of difference. Of course, if you choose to use the method of agreement, they need to agree on the dependent variable. And so your comparative method should be chosen based on the variation across the cases that you've chosen to study. And as you choose your cases, and as you think about your hypothesis, what you'll find is you might need to look in a variety of places and consider a variety of different countries. Sometimes students have a tendency to begin with countries that are interesting to them. That can be a useful approach, but the issue there is that you don't really know if those countries vary or agree in the variables of interest to you. And so it's often better to begin with the variables that are interesting and then find countries that have the values on the variables that you want to study. So in my case, although I really am interested in Latin American countries, it's also been useful for me to study countries like Portugal and Turkey and others because they have patterns of similarities and differences that have often been useful for me. So I want you to think outside of the box and think about the variables that you're analyzing and then choose your cases based on that. Now, once you've chosen cases and clarified your hypothesis, clarified your method, you need to, of course, provide the evidence that supports the argument or supports the hypothesis. And in total, you will be evaluated based on these different components. There really are four things: the research question, the comparative approach, the hypothesis, and then the use of evidence. And what this does then is this assignment brings together all of the different parts of the process of conducting comparative research. This is an exercise in conducting comparative research. We are engaging in an inference drawing and trying to reach conclusions about the world of comparative politics. And so you are doing comparative politics when you do this assignment. And from the beginning, that's been my objective, and it's always been my objective. This, though, is a challenging assignment, and it's one that requires you to use the different components from the course in a coherent and integrated way. And so don't take this assignment for granted. I'd like you to begin thinking about this now, even if you did a really great job and are really satisfied with that critique in the formulation of the hypothesis that you came up with. So you do have plenty of time. It's due on December 11th. It's only December 1st. I do hope that you'll begin working on this sooner rather than later. However, I'm realistic, and I realize that you have a variety of constraints, and we're working under difficult circumstances. And so I'm aware of this. I just ask that you make your best effort given the circumstances. So before we continue, let's take any comments or questions about this assignment. Those comments or questions might be cleared up in the subsequent slides, but let's first talk about the prompt. Are there any comments or questions about this prompt?
I did have a question about the prompt per se, but I might be mistaken, but I recall a couple of weeks ago that you may have changed the due date to December 13th, I believe.
Neela asks a very important question. If we choose to continue to explore the critique we wrote, are we allowed to use our exact critique paper and just go more in depth, or should we start from scratch using the same hypothesis that we created? Let me be absolutely clear. You are not allowed to use your exact critique paper. That is not acceptable because you can't get credit when you duplicate work. That's actually an example of sort of academic malpractice, if you will. But the question is a good one, and I understand why the question comes as a question, because I'm encouraging you to use that work. You need to begin with just the hypothesis itself. And so use that hypothesis as a basis. Do not duplicate the critique paper, because we can't necessarily give you credit if you do. And remember that the critique paper, Alejandra, I don't believe it is. If anyone else can't hear me, please let me know, but I think that I'm unmuted. I wonder if maybe there's something on your end. Remember that the
Papa, we
critique
can't
paper
hear you. I don't
required
think you can hear us.
I can't hear you? Okay. Is someone talking right now? I mean, does someone want to try to comment right now? Someone just say something, please.
Can you hear us now?
Yes. Okay, so did I miss something? Did someone say something?
Yeah, earlier I'd asked a question about the due date because a couple weeks ago I had heard you mention you had pushed it back to the 13th, I believe.
No, the 11th. The 11th is Friday of the last week.
Okay.
13th is a Sunday. So let me be clear though. You can't duplicate the critique paper. You just want to use the hypothesis as a basis. Because remember that the critique involves addressing the literature and a theoretical argument from an article that you select from the syllabus. That's not something that we need to do for this assignment. And so it would kind of get you off track. But that's a really, really good question, Neela, and I'm so happy that you would ask. And it's an important question that is not necessarily obvious, but I just do need to be clear that you can't do that. And so just use the hypothesis as a basis. Are there additional comments or questions about the prompt? Okay. So your research papers need to do these 5 things. When you write your research paper, you want to use this as sort of a self-check test so you can be sure that you've ticked off all the necessary boxes. There are no surprises here. This is how you'll be evaluated on the paper. And as with the critiques, there will be a rubric that brings together these different components. And so this is the starting point. These are the essential components. First and foremost, you need to form a research question. Now, this is going to be the same research question as the research question that you addressed in the critique paper. It's just that you'll be doing this in a extended way that doesn't involve addressing that particular article and has more to do with you building your argument through an exploration of cases. And so the second part then is forming a hypothesis, and you use that hypothesis to eventually test or sort of study those cases that you'll select. In turn, you select 2 cases that you will use to test your hypothesis. So one of those cases will be your country that you studied in your critique. The second case will be a new case that you select that you can compare to the first case that you studied. And so you'll be thinking about what cases might fit well with the first case that you studied. And the good thing about this is that you know that first case really well already. So for example, in my study, I chose the case of Ghana. And I will show you in a moment that Ghana can be compared to South Africa if the question is what explains variation in state strength. In your own situation, you obviously may have chosen a different country, and you'll want to think about, is there a country in the area or in the neighborhood that has a similar or a different experience? Is there a way that I can compare this country to another country to test my hypothesis? In turn, you want to use your comparative method to make comparisons across the cases. So that means, in the first place, identifying the method, and then talking about how the cases fit into that comparative framework. So what are the similarities held constant across the cases? What are the differences that might be held constant across the cases? These are the important components of the comparative approach, because that's how you control for those alternative explanations. You don't need to have a whole array of background variables, just a couple, 2 or 3. I just want you to show me that you're able to use the comparative methods in a systematic and effective way. And then finally, you want to present your evidence. And this will probably be the bulk of the paper. You present the evidence from your cases to support your hypothesis. This is really the body, or sort of the bulk of the body. The rest of this will be in the body as well, but this is the bulk of the paper. Now, when you look at all this, you might be thinking, that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff to do. But the truth is, you can do each of these very succinctly, and before long, you'll be at your 12-page limit. That might seem like a long paper, but when we have relatively specific criteria and specific instructions, I think that you'll find that it comes together pretty smoothly, as long as you put in your best effort and you give yourself some time to do the work. Before we continue, are there any comments or questions about this?
Just a question.
Yes, Anna.
It's about 12 page and all, and plus the citation must be maybe 14 pages.
Sure. I think that for a paper like this, you could write a good paper with somewhere between 5 and 10 sources, probably.
Oh, okay.
You don't need to overdo it. And I'd like you to think carefully about the sources as well. And so cite those sources using a citation style of your choosing, as long as it's consistent, and have a references page at the end. You might have a page of references, but you do want to meet the 12 pages through the text itself of the paper. Sorry, everyone, I'm a little distracted. My cats are chasing each other and doing parkour off the furniture.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Are there additional comments or questions about this? By the way, everybody, let me know if we have any issues with the volume. Stephen asks, do we need a title page or just a college header? It's up to you. College header is fine. At a minimum, I want you to give it a title. Give it a title. Think a little bit about the title of the paper, but it's up to you. If you want a title page, cool, but it's not necessary. Sometimes a title page is nice, and since it's electronic, you don't have to print that extra sheet. You might ask your TAs what their preference is. They're after all the ones who will be doing the grading and will be engaging with you on the assignment. Definitely give it a title. I remember when I was in graduate school, I submitted a paper and it was just like this analytic essay, and I didn't give it a title. And the professor wrote back, give it a title next time, okay? And I just thought to myself, but I don't title well. How am I supposed to give it a good title? But take some time to think about, what's an interesting name for the paper. Ideally, less than 15 words. I went to an institute one time for qualitative research, and one of the activities that they had us do was come up with a succinct title for your most recent paper, less than 15 words, or maximum 15 words. So I always try to stick to that. I think that it's probably a good tip. All right, everybody, let me talk about an example of a research paper. This is what I would do if I was in your shoes. And before I discuss this example, I want you to notice a few things. In this example, I'm using components from the class. I'm using themes and issues from the class. My dependent variable is state strength, or specifically state weakness. My independent variable is democratic consolidation. We know how to measure all of these things. We've got all sorts of ways of thinking about this from the class that we can apply and use in our papers. And so I encourage you to begin with the material from the class and the themes and the issues from the class, because that's what we know well and what you're probably best prepared to deal with. I think a good way of doing this is to think about, well, what really interests me that we have already studied or that I know a little bit about that is relevant to the class. Granted, you probably already chose a topic or an article and formulated an argument for the critique that is similar to your interests. But in this paper, you'll have more choices to make. And so I want you to think about the course content, but also what is interesting to you and what matters to you. You know, after all, we have ethical and moral commitments that inform the choices we make. Let's make no mistake, we gravitate towards questions that are important to us and that we value or see as important. And so really kind of lean into that and use this as an opportunity to extend your interests while using the course content. So for me, I'm really interested in state strength and state-society relations. I'm interested in transitions and democratic progress and reform. I'm interested in democratic politics and coalition building and interests. And so my research paper would focus on the question, why are some African states weak while others are not? And this is obviously informed by Herbst, who addressed this question by arguing that civil war explains state weakness in Africa. I disagree. And while I'm not actually talking at all about Herbst in this paper, I'm developing my argument that democratic politics, and specifically democratic progress and consolidation and competitive democratic politics, explains state weakness in Africa. This is a controversial argument because we normally think of democracy and state building as going hand in hand. But I want to be bold and ruffle some feathers. And so my hypothesis is where democracy is consolidated, African states will be weaker. States will be stronger where democracy is not consolidated. Very straightforward, very observable. Is it true that more consolidated African democracies are weaker states? Is it true that less consolidated African democracies are stronger states? We can look out and find out if that's actually the case. And so I've chosen two cases. First, Ghana, from 2000 to the present. Ghana transitioned to democracy in 2000 and remains one today. Ghana is also a weak state. South Africa is a relatively strong state, transitioned in 1994. It is a sort of imperfect democracy because it is a one-party state. The African National Congress has dominated national politics basically since the transition. And so according to our definition, that's not a democratic or a sort of a kind of consolidated or a refined democratic system. It's really more of a crude sort of imperfect democracy, maybe a competitive authoritarian system. It's not really a democracy. So I have my two cases, and I'm going to use the method of difference to test my hypothesis that democratic consolidation accounts for state weakness in Africa. And I look out into my cases, and I try to find the links between democratic politics and state weakness. I look at, for example, coalitions that defeated reforms that would have reformed state institutions. I look, for example, for evidence of mobilization to resist changes that might have put more hands in the power of bureaucrats or state agencies. I look for these kinds of things to try to connect democratic politics with the sort of failure of state strengthening in Ghana. In my South African case, I sort of look for the other thing. I look for the capacity of a strong party to sort of rule unilaterally and make decisions that don't need to take into consideration competitive factors. They can sort of rule by fiat in some sense. And so state strengthening through bureaucracy building, institutional reforms, all of those things become easier. And if the interests of the ANC also align with the goal of strengthening the state, that's also relevant. And so this is what I look for when I use my method of difference to test my hypothesis. I'm looking for a chain of events or a sequence of events that connect these variables and create a single line of continuity between them, and shows or highlights a causal story that helps to flesh out the links between the variables in my design. And so where do I look for this evidence? Well, I'm going to look in the secondary academic literature on democracy and state weakness in these countries. And I'm seeking that evidence that links democracy and state weakness. So I look for case studies on Ghana's democracy and state building. I look for case studies on South Africa's democracy and state building. I search high and low for any empirical evidence or detail or information that might support my argument. Now, it's impossible for me to read everything, but it's worthwhile still for me to assess as much of the literature as I can, realistically, and provide support for my argument. That can be a persuasive research paper, establishing these relationships that I'm hypothesizing. Now, remember that this was my hypothesis that I put forward for my critique as well. And so this is my example of how I'm building on my hypothesis to extend my analysis and develop a larger research project. So as you can see here, I'm not duplicating the critique paper. I'm not duplicating the exact paper. I'm just using sort of just the hypothesis, one case. I'm building from the sort of building blocks of that paper. Those building blocks are independent of the way I wrote that critique, right? So you don't want to duplicate any of that language. You want to write a new paper that nevertheless uses the hypothesis in the case as one of the two cases in your paper, the case that you use in your critique. Are there any comments or questions about my example and how this might relate to what you would do in your research paper?
Another question. What about the use, do we have to use a special theory?
So you can use a theoretical perspective that maybe comes from somewhere in the class, if that's useful for you. You can also develop a brand new one of your own. I think that if you can, you should try to extend the hypothesis that you developed in the critique paper. And remember that that hypothesis was an original hypothesis that you developed based on the evidence that you collected. So yes, if you want, you could use a theoretical perspective from the class. There are many perspectives from the class, but you don't have to. And I would ultimately encourage you to try to extend your original hypothesis.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So Ian, the difference is that the critique paper is a criticism of a theoretical argument in an article on the syllabus. You're primarily critiquing an article on the syllabus. In this research paper, you're developing the support for the alternative hypothesis that you developed through that critique on the empirical and theoretical critique paper. So this is sort of an extension of some parts of what you did. It's not really the same. That empirical and theoretical critique was primarily a criticism of an existing article. This research paper is empirical support for your own original hypothesis. Is that distinction clear? Okay, I realize that it might be difficult to see the distinction. and I want to help you and support you all as much as possible. So please just let me know if it's not clear, because this is an important set of objectives we have, and I ultimately want us to be on the same page. And I'm well aware that sometimes my instructions are not that clear. So we can be honest and straightforward about it. That's okay, Ian, no problem. It's been a long semester and we've been through so much. Ian's just saying that he momentarily forgot that we critiqued an article in the last assignment. Yeah, I'm sure that Ian, like others, has a number of classes and you're doing a lot of work and you're not in classrooms, and so there's a good chance that you're doing other things too, and there's a lot going on, and I don't fault anyone. So let's talk a little bit about data. Now, data is a really freighted term. I remember when I was an undergrad, I was never really clear what data was. I took a lot of like research methods courses, and they would have us like reproduce studies, and we would kind of collect the data and use data sets. And my understanding was that, oh, well, this is, data because it's numerical and it's quantitative and it's like statistical and involves coefficients. That's definitely data. But empirical data is actually a more encompassing term. It really means more than just empirical quantitative evidence. It means empirical information of any kind: facts, examples, descriptions, statistics, coefficients from statistical analyses. All of these are examples of data. They're just different kinds of data. And so as you approach this paper, I want you to think about this in the broadest way you can. And that means thinking about data as information that you collect for the purpose of analysis. This can be facts and statistics and examples. It can be patterns or descriptions. It can be quotes. You name it. This is all relevant. These are examples of qualitative data, facts, examples, or descriptions that you would use to describe a case in a kind of thick way. Quantitative data would include like coefficients from existing studies, statistics that come from some sort of statistical analysis of data. But I want you to actually think primarily in terms of qualitative information for this paper, because you don't have, I'm assuming, the software on your computer to conduct a statistical analysis or a regression analysis, and nor should you necessarily. If you do, that's great, good for you. But I want us to think in terms of a qualitative approach. I want you to think of the cases as sort of receptacles of information and facts and examples that you can examine and use to contextualize the cases. And in comparative politics, this is our comparative advantage. One of the things that we do best is we conduct case studies. We conduct studies of a small set of cases, and we examine them in detail, and we contextualize them by using what we sometimes call thick description. We use facts and examples and descriptions, and we use information, right? Empirical information that is whole and sort of contextual to paint a picture that is broader than any statistic or coefficient might be. So in this instance, the data is largely going to be qualitative. And I want you to think in terms of that qualitative approach. Granted, if you have a data set and you're already conducting a regression analysis, you can do that too. I don't want to hold you back. But in this class, we've primarily been using comparative methods in the methods of agreement and difference. In that usually involves using qualitative data, although it can involve statistical analysis inside the cases. And so in the final analysis, the advantage of this approach in this paper and generally is that it provides us what we call thick description. And thick description is just a reference to the way that we paint a sort of detailed picture of the case as a whole entity that we examine in its totality. We don't, whack off just a part of the case and examine that in isolation. We look at the case as a whole and we treat it as a whole entity. And in my own research, this is what I do too. I conduct case studies and use comparative methods. And so in my research, I primarily use primary sources like newspapers and government documents and legislation, but I also conduct interviews and I do other stuff like that. These are all examples of qualitative data, and these are qualitative sources of data. And so this is the approach I'd like you to think in terms of. And so for us, data means that any empirical information that can give you some leverage on your question. Okay, so we've reached the stage where we need to begin to think individually about our approach. And this is the set of questions that I want you to address as you brainstorm individually your approach to this assignment. What I'm going to do is put you in groups, and I'd like you to work together and talk about this for a few minutes, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, maybe more. Then we'll come back together and we can discuss our approach to the paper and talk about any questions we have or any best practices that came up. I think that this is a useful exercise, not just because of some of the lack of clarity about the assignment on my part, but also because you learn often more from each other than you do from me. And this is one of the real advantages of being able to interact with your peers. And so use this as an opportunity to learn from each other. Think about in each individual's approach and how it relates to yours and what you might take from that and what you might learn from that. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to create groups of 3. We have 31 participants, and that basically leaves 10 groups. One of the groups will have 4, but we should have plenty of time to incorporate everyone. So give me a moment here while I set this up. All right, everybody, I've opened the rooms and we are going to do some brainstorming. Use the chat if you want to reach out to me, and you can certainly speak to me too if you want. But we'll take some time to think about our approach, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Hey, Mr. Grimes. Professor Grimes.
Hi, Alexis. Yes.
I am so sorry. I just got up right now. I'm just wondering what we're doing.
No worries, Alexis. We're just doing like a brainstorming activity as part of a writing workshop for
Okay.
the research paper. So um, we did have kind of a lecture where I sort of set this up and I gave an outline and an example, but students are in groups right now, just kind of discussing their plan. Would you like me to put you in a group?
Um, no, I think I'll just have a conversation with Miss Giacomin later on. I think I don't want to interrupt them when they're in the process of doing their outline. I really am sorry. I was not expecting to wake up this late.
No worries. Seriously, it's, you know, no harm, no foul. It's all good.
Okay. Um, do we have any assigned work this week other than the paper?
Well, the paper is due on December 11th. So this week we don't have anything apart from just the reading that we'll do for the class on the unit on political participation.
Okay. Um, then I will go to Miss Giacomin's her TA session, her office hours.
Okay.
Sorry about that again.
No, no worries.
All right. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Mhm. All right, everybody. I'm going to give you all about 1 or 2 minutes. Try to wrap it up, and I'll close the rooms at that point, and we'll get back into it. All right. All breakout rooms will close in 60 seconds. So as we reconvene, I think that a useful exercise for us as a group is, for anyone who feels comfortable using either the chat or the mic, to really address three questions. What is your research question? What cases do you plan to select? And what comparative method will you use? Or where will you look for data? Does anyone want to start us off?
So I had watched the video regarding Thailand and how that government has faced something around like 15 coups within the past several decades. And my question was, why was that, or what led to the political instability that led to those coups, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in my hypothesis, I believe that territory and like the dispersion of power across a country is what results in political instability, because I was going to be comparing Singapore and Thailand. Singapore is basically a city state. In Thailand, um, the largest city in Thailand is Bangkok, which has like a population of like 10 million or something around that number. And the second largest city in Thailand is only like 200,000 people. So I think a main contributor to that is the fact that the rest of the country in Thailand doesn't receive the same attention from the government as Bangkok, because in Bangkok, a lot of power and wealth is concentrated there, while the rest of the country, or while the rest of Thailand is rural, remote, and very poor. And I think that that lack of income equality and power as concentrated in remote areas, is the lack of that, it results in the political instability that we've seen in Thailand. And the same could be said into the Philippines, but I haven't really looked that far into that. But I guess the situation there is similar to Thailand.
Wow, man. Well, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. And like, it sounds super logical too, and creative. This is a good example, everyone, of how we can use themes from the class and use methods to come up with something very creative and new. And I like that Manuel is focusing on military coups, because we know that military coups destabilize or end democracy, and that they usually precipitate the formation of an authoritarian regime. And so how that then relates to issues like the regional distribution of power or wealth, very interesting. And the comparison to Singapore is also neat. Does anyone else want to chat a little bit about their approach or what they have in mind?
Can I?
Absolutely.
Okay. I was trying to find the duration of the crisis from, let me put some volume. Okay. Okay. The duration of the crisis and the violence from Colombia and Venezuela, because both countries are similar in the violence and different in the government. They are different because one is, I guess, is Venezuela is how they call it. It's different, but it's not democratic already. In Colombia, they have elections also for 4 years period, and they can re-elect also, like this country. They can be 8 years, but the same, re-elect again. I'm sorry by my accent, but I feel nervous. But my question was, I try to use the theory of violence also, and the method of, did you mention before, that is the agreement and difference. I will use that method.
That sounds great, Anna Martha. So first, I can completely understand you. Your English is very clear. Your idea is really interesting, and it's true. Venezuela is a dictatorship, and Colombia is a democracy, and the countries are otherwise similar in some important ways, as you point out. And that means then that it's interesting to study maybe how violence factors in or what role that plays, but why they differ in terms of the form of regime, why the regime differs across the cases. And that's really interesting. And those are obviously two very important cases. Venezuela is a country that we need to understand better because the endurance of the authoritarian regime there is very puzzling for a variety of reasons. But that sounds wonderful, and I would love to read that paper. Very good example, again, of how we can use the themes from the class to create new questions and study countries and put them together in creative ways. So I'm really pleased to hear these different examples of how students in the class are thinking about their research papers. Does anyone else want to share their plans?
Yeah, so I was also looking at Venezuela, and I was going to look at the effects that I can't talk colonialization has on state formation, and I wanted to see if I can find other examples that kind of tell the same story as Venezuela, in terms of like in their case, Spain was the colonizer that was enslaving the indigenous people that lived there and taking like natural resources. So I wanted to look at other cases where maybe it says the same thing. Like once they gain their independence, they have like a hard time gaining strength.
So the ways that colonialism might constrain state formation after independence. Also a very interesting question. In the long duration of the period of time between independence and the present in Venezuela is also interesting because that's a big picture to examine, and that gets us thinking about the long term. One interesting question is, well, first, how do different colonial sort of origins or pathways affect political development. And so, for example, are countries that were colonized by Spain more likely to be authoritarian because of the very sort of restrictive and illiberal institutions that Spain left behind? Is it the case that countries that were colonized by Great Britain are more democratic because of the more liberal institutions that Great Britain left behind? Is it the case that we can find other examples of countries that were colonized by Spain or Belgium or some other very, very brutal colonizer who are also authoritarian today, but are nevertheless very, very different than Venezuela? These are all very productive lines of inquiry. And Jake's example is a good example of how we can study the case of Venezuela from different vantage points. Anna Martha is interested in events that have occurred more recently, in the role of violence in social relations. Jake's more interested in the long term and maybe how the sort of origin story of these places might affect the circumstances today. Both are equally valid, both are very interesting. And what's more, I think that your TAs, and myself included, will be very excited to see like some of the competing perspectives that emerge in the papers. Inevitably, many of you will address the question of, why are some countries democratic while others are authoritarian? That, after all, is possibly the most important question of all in comparative politics. So there will be competing perspectives, and many of you might study similar countries. And so it'll be interesting to see how the different perspectives come out of the papers and line up and kind of jostle for position. All equally valid, but also interesting to see the differences. What are some other approaches that folks have planned for the paper?
I commented on the chat, so if you could review that.
Oh, right on. Cool. I'll
that
check
would
that.
be cool.
Sorry, my my Zoom is not cooperating. Rady says, I would like to study North Korea in their political and economic situation. I will be looking at the historical factors that led to the consolidation of the present totalitarian regime. My hypothesis then will be formulated over the idea that North Korea was kind of isolated themselves from the rest of the world. And by doing so, they have kind of blinded their population and have destroyed any possible idea of freedom or at least economic development. In order to make a contrast, I will use its nearest neighbor, South Korea, who has done the total opposite. I'm still not so clear in how I'm going to develop the paper. I need to do more research on the topic. Yeah, so the comparison of North Korea and South Korea is a famous comparison for reasons that Rady is all over. Obviously, these countries differ radically in terms of some of the most important outcomes: regime type, economic development, connections to the rest of the world, etc. But they otherwise have a lot of similar characteristics because they are, after all, two parts of what was originally one country. And so comparing them is one of the best examples of what we might refer to as sort of like a pseudo-natural experiment, where we kind of are able to observe how a treatment at a certain point in time can affect what happens next in different situations. This is a good example of how we can really, really study comparatively these outcomes of interest to us. One thing to think about, Rady, and this is the case for everyone, is, and Rady acknowledges that a little bit more thinking has to go into it, is kind of thinking precisely about what the sort of dependent variable is. Is it regime type? Is it economic growth? Is it inequality? Is it military spending or the size of the military? Who knows, right? These are all issues that might be interesting to look at, but you'll want to clarify what they are and what you want to look at in particular. This is also a recommendation that I would give to anyone who has countries that they're really interested in, but hasn't figured out whether it's maybe regime type or presence or absence of conflict or something like that that is what they want to study. But this is something that comes together, right? You know, you don't go into it always with a really clear idea exactly what the variables are. Sometimes that comes together sort of on the ground, and that's fine. And after all, one of the advantages of comparative research is that we can formulate hypotheses within the cases as we do the case study, right? We can form out of sample hypotheses, or we can form hypotheses through the study of the cases themselves, and that's acceptable. We've decided amongst us in comparative politics that though some oppose that practice, that it is acceptable. And so Grady can do that, and so can anyone else. Can we hear from anyone else about what their approach might be? Jose says, I'm looking at the US healthcare system and we'll be comparing it to our neighboring countries, Mexico or Canada. I will be looking at things like cost effectiveness and talk about healthcare tourism and how often it happens. When someone goes to a country for things like dental care or certain surgeries since it's cheaper, I'll probably compare them all and share which one I believe has the best healthcare. So this is obviously a very important question, and it's one that's so relevant to the current debate in this country. And it's a question that makes us think about important differences, even among countries that are relatively similar, Canada and the United States. One recommendation, Jose, I have is do your best to try to sort of frame this or pitch this or approach this in ways that connect to themes from the class. Sometimes if we get a little too far afield, we're not able to use the knowledge from the class as effectively, and doesn't make the question any less important. It's extremely important. It's just that we want to demonstrate knowledge and use those themes as best as we can. Now, of course, the comparative method is especially useful for you in this situation because you've got very clear variables that you've already identified, and you can measure those pretty similarly across the cases. And so I would encourage Jose to think a little bit about the themes from the class and how they relate, but to definitely lean into your comparative method and how you can very succinctly compare the countries by examining the specific and very well-defined variables that you've outlined. So, and that's a recommendation for anyone and everyone. In general, we want our papers to connect to the themes from the class as much as possible. And not just because we want to demonstrate knowledge, but because we want to, as much as possible, sort of participate in comparative politics in terms of the key questions and issues that are still hotly debated today. We've got a few more minutes, and I'd like to hear from some more folks. What other approaches do we have in mind?
Okay, can I ask another question?
Of course.
This is a question. When will you put the study guide for the test?
Oh, yes, the study guide.
Yes.
Good question, Anna Martha. I'll be posting that this week. So probably Thursday.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Plan is to give you plenty of time to prepare for that. And I hope that the study guide last time was useful for you, but now that Anna Martha has actually raised this, Does anyone have any recommendations? Did you like the way the study guide was put together? Do you think that it would be more useful if there were other components? What did you like? What did you dislike?
Oh, I have trouble when the analysis the questions, because I spend time answer three of the questions, the last question, the analysis, I mean. And then the one that I didn't do about the state, I didn't finish that one, and it was I got the mistake to answer the 4 questions. Actually, it's not a mistake, but I spent too much time answer the 4 questions, the last 4 questions, and I didn't uh, see the guides. You say just 1 or just 2, I guess.
Okay, so what I take from that is maybe it would be helpful if there were, and this is not something I'll promise, but I'll consider it. Maybe it would be helpful if there were fewer essay questions as sample questions on the study guide.
Oh, yes, essay question, yes, because takes time to answer those essay questions. For me, takes time. Okay.
Okay, no, absolutely, Anna Martha, and I'm sensitive to that, and I want to support every one of you in the best way that I can, and I know that your TAs do too. And so we do our best to be responsive and incorporate your input. And we also challenge you to help make the class better if there's something wrong. And so we want to listen to you and understand your needs and what worked well for you or what didn't. And so my sense is that the study guides have been pretty useful. Rady says it was great, pretty precise. The essay was the hardest part. I did anticipate that. Yeah, the essay is more demanding. And with the study guides, full disclosure, my objective is to try to give you something that is manageable to complete, that will prepare you to write about any topic that might come up on the exam. And so when you prepare, creating outlines for each question might be useful. Maybe not necessarily drafting full responses, but being ready to maybe write something for any given question that could come up from the study guide. And so with this study guide, as before, I'll try to give you a manageable set of questions that incorporate the key themes and that position you to sort of prepare in a broad way for the final. And then hopefully, ideally, feel less stressed about the timing and the space available to you to complete the exam once it comes up. So we're out of time, everybody. This was a useful meeting today. I intended on this being sort of more administrative, and the workshop I thought was very useful, but it's also good that we're beginning to think about the final as well, and I'll have more on that in the coming days. But do continue to interact with me, and of course, go to your TAs and use your TAs. Jackie and Chao Hung are very, very excited to be working with you, and I know that it's been a great semester. And so we're very happy about how things have gone, and we're excited to finish it up strong. So thanks for being here, and see you on Thursday.